The little black girl ran to the biker across the academy courtyard as a shadow followed her through the halls. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's dive into the story. The school courtyard was eerily quiet, the sound of her footsteps echoing on the pavement as she rushed toward the biker standing across the field. His black leather vest gleamed in the sunlight, contrasting sharply with the soft green grass beneath him. She was small, no older than 10, her braided hair flying in the wind as she sprinted with all the strength her small body could muster. The breeze carried the faint smell of her fear, her heart pounding in her chest as her mind raced. She had no time to think, only to run, to find the one person she trusted, the one person who could help her. She didn't dare look back. Behind her, through the school's halls, a shadow was stalking her, following her every move. It was a presence that had been there for days, lurking in the corners of her vision, always just out of reach but never far away. It was a presence she had come to fear, a presence that now seemed to be closing in on her. The biker, seeing the girl approach, stood up from where he leaned against his motorcycle, his gaze sharp and alert. He could tell something was wrong. The urgency in her footsteps, the fear in her eyes, told him everything he needed to know. Without a word, he stepped forward, meeting her halfway across the courtyard. She didn't stop running until she was right in front of him, breathless and wide-eyed. Her small hands grasped the sleeve of his jacket, and she looked up at him, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Please, help me," she said, her words barely more than a whisper. He's after me. I don't know what to do." The biker's expression softened, but there was no time for comfort now. He glanced around, scanning the area for any sign of danger, any clue as to who or what she was running from. He knew this girl, had known her since she was a baby, and he had promised her father years ago that he would always look out for her. He could feel the weight of that promise now, heavy on his shoulders. "You're safe now," he said quietly, his voice steady and reassuring. "Tell me what's going on." The girl's eyes flicked nervously toward the school, her shoulders shaking as she tried to catch her breath. "It's him, the man who's been following me. He's in the school right now." She looked at him, pleading with her eyes. "He's not just anyone. He's dangerous." The biker's eyes narrowed, his grip on her shoulder tightening as he pulled her closer. He didn't ask for details. He didn't need to. He had seen that kind of fear before, in the eyes of people who had been hunted, people who had nowhere left to turn. He was her last chance. "Stay with me," he said firmly, his voice unwavering. "We're not going anywhere until I know you're safe." She nodded, clinging to him as if her life depended on it. She had no one else to turn to. No one else who would understand. No one else who could protect her. But he would. He had to. And together, they would face whatever came next. The biker's hand tightened around the girl's shoulder as he guided her away from the courtyard, his mind racing through options. The sun was setting, and the shadows around them seemed to grow longer, more menacing. The girl was still trembling, her small body shaking under the weight of fear and exhaustion. The biker, known to most as Forge, kept his eyes on the school's entrance, his instincts telling him that something wasn't right. He had been in dangerous situations before, but this felt different. This wasn't just a random act of violence. It was personal. Forge had always kept his promises, and years ago, he had sworn to protect this girl, Maya, after her father had died. He had failed Tyrone, but he wasn't going to fail Maya. As Forge led Maya toward the motorcycle, he could feel her eyes on him. She was scared, but there was a quiet determination in her gaze, as if she knew the biker would get her out of this. They reached the motorcycle, and Forge helped her climb onto the back, adjusting the helmet on her head. "Hold on tight," he said, his voice calm, though his mind was anything but. The engine roared to life, and they pulled away from the school. As they sped through the streets, Forge couldn't help but glance back toward the school. He knew the man who had been following Maya. He had seen him around town before. But that man wasn't just anyone. He was connected to something much darker, something that forged a bond between the biker and the man that would not be broken easily. Forge had always known that one day, the past would catch up to him. That day had come. The road ahead was dark, and the night was closing in fast. The headlights from the bike sliced through the darkness as they made their way down the winding highway. Maya was silent behind him, and Forge could feel the weight of her fear, but he also knew she was more than capable of handling the situation. She had grown up in a world of hardship, and though her life had been scarred by loss, she had a strength that Forge admired. "You're safe now," Forge said, his voice steady, though his thoughts were scattered. He couldn't help but wonder who else was out there. Who else might be looking for Maya? He didn't want to scare her, but the truth was, they were not out of danger yet. Forge's eyes darted to the rearview mirror, scanning for anything unusual. The shadow he had seen earlier was still there, still following them from a distance. It was a car, a black sedan, its headlights dim in the distance but unmistakable. The hairs on the back of Forge's neck stood up. He could feel the presence of the car growing closer, and the tension in the air became thick, almost suffocating. "We need to get off the road," Forge muttered to himself. He took a sharp turn onto a dirt road that led deeper into the woods. Maya gasped behind him, but she held on tight, trusting him to keep her safe. Forge had ridden these roads before, but tonight, the woods seemed darker, more threatening. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, as if nature itself was warning them of the danger ahead. The bike bounced over the uneven terrain, but Forge kept his focus. He had to stay one step ahead of whoever was following them. The black sedan was still in the rearview mirror, but now it was moving faster, gaining ground. Forge's grip on the handlebars tightened. He didn't have much time. The forest was getting thicker, and the road was becoming harder to navigate, but Forge pushed on. Suddenly, the bike jolted over a large bump, and Maya let out a startled cry. Forge glanced over his shoulder to see her holding on, her eyes wide with fear. He tried to reassure her with a glance, but deep down, he knew they were running out of time. The forest was closing in around them, and the sound of the approaching car was getting louder. It wouldn't be long before they were trapped. "Stay low," Forge shouted over the roar of the bike's engine. He veered off the dirt path and onto a narrow trail that led deeper into the woods. The car behind them followed suit, but Forge wasn't going to make this easy. He turned sharply, weaving in and out of trees, his bike kicking up dirt and leaves behind them. Maya held on tightly, her body pressed against his back as they raced through the forest. The black sedan struggled to keep up, but it was clear that Forge knew these woods better than anyone. He could feel the tension in the air, could hear the crunch of tires on the dirt as the car tried to follow. Forge pushed the bike harder, his eyes scanning the trail ahead. He had to make it to the old cabin in the woods. He knew it would provide some cover. He had promised Maya's father he would protect her, and no one was going to break that promise. The car was still behind them, gaining ground, but Forge wasn't going to stop. Not now. Not when he had come this far. The cabin was only a few miles away, but it might as well have been an eternity. The sound of the car's engine grew louder, and Forge's heart raced as he pushed the bike harder. Maya's grip tightened around his waist, and he could feel the warmth of her fear pressing against his back. They couldn't keep this up forever. The cabin was close, but the car was getting closer too. Forge had to make a choice, but it was a choice that could change everything. Forge's heart pounded as the roar of the black sedan's engine grew louder behind them, a sound that seemed to be chasing them through the dense forest. The night was closing in fast, the trees blurring around them as Forge skillfully weaved the motorcycle through the narrow, winding trail. He could feel the weight of Maya's fear pressing against his back, and despite his own instincts to push forward, a gnawing sense of danger hung in the air. The cabin was close. He knew it was, but the car was gaining on them, its headlights cutting through the trees like a beacon. Maya's grip on him tightened, her small hands shaking with the force of her fear. "We're almost there," Forge muttered to her, his voice low, steady, trying to reassure them both. But inside, his mind raced with calculations. Could they make it to the cabin in time? The bike bounced over rocks and roots, and Forge glanced back over his shoulder just in time to see the black sedan breaking through the trees. The car was getting closer. It was only a matter of time before they caught up. Forge's eyes locked onto the trail ahead. He couldn't outrun them much longer. "Hold on." Forge gritted through his teeth. He pulled the throttle, urging the bike to go faster, his boots kicking up dirt as they tore through the wilderness. Maya's voice trembled behind him. "What if we don't make it?" Forge didn't answer right away. There was no time for fear. He needed to focus. The cabin was just ahead. He could see its outline through the trees. The dilapidated structure loomed like a fortress, the place where he had always planned to take Maya if things ever got this bad. As they neared the cabin, Forge made a sharp turn to the left, veering off the trail and into a thick patch of underbrush. He could hear the car behind them, the engine now roaring like an animal closing in on its prey. They were running out of road. Maya let out a small gasp as they crashed through the underbrush, the motorcycle's tires skidding over uneven ground. The sound of the car following them was deafening now. Forge's mind raced, calculating his next move. "Get ready," he called back to Maya. She clung to him tightly, her small body pressed against his as they shot through the trees. The cabin was close. They just needed to get there, just a few more seconds. Forge pushed the bike harder, feeling the muscles in his legs strain as he steered them toward the clearing where the cabin stood. He had one chance to get them to safety. The roar of the black sedan's engine grew louder, and Forge knew they were closing in. He could hear the tires screeching, the car weaving through the trees. They were almost there. Forge's mind was made up. As they approached the cabin, he braked sharply, the bike skidding to a stop just in front of the weathered wooden structure. The black sedan came to a halt behind them, its headlights shining down on the two of them like a spotlight. Forge's eyes locked onto the car, his jaw tight with determination. He could feel Maya's heart racing against his back. This was it. He had promised her father that he would protect her, no matter what. And he wasn't about to break that promise now. "Stay close," Forge said to Maya, his voice low and fierce. She nodded, still trembling, but her eyes were steady now. Forge's hands tightened on the handlebars as he scanned the area, trying to assess the situation. The car's headlights flickered as the driver stepped out. Forge didn't wait. He swung his leg over the motorcycle and stood tall, positioning himself between Maya and the car. The figure that emerged from the sedan was tall, wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap that shadowed his face. Forge's muscles tensed. He didn't recognize the man, but he could feel the danger in his presence. The man took a step forward, his voice cold and calculated. "You think you can protect her, Forge? You think you can outrun what's coming for her?" Forge didn't respond right away. He wasn't going to waste words. He stepped forward, his eyes never leaving the man. "You don't know what you're dealing with," the man continued, his voice dripping with malice. "This isn't about you or her. This is bigger than both of you." Forge's fists clenched at his sides, his body coiled like a spring. He wasn't about to back down. Maya had no one left, and Forge wasn't going to let this man take her. "You made a mistake," Forge said, his voice low and controlled. "You came after the wrong person." The man sneered, taking another step closer. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Forge's eyes flicked over to Maya, who was standing behind him, her hands clasped tightly together in front of her. She was scared, but she wasn't running. She wasn't backing down. That's when Forge knew. He had to end this, now. The man lunged forward, a quick movement, too fast for Forge to react with anything but instinct. But Forge was ready. He swung his fist, catching the man in the jaw with a sharp crack. The man staggered back, and for a brief moment, Forge thought he had won. But then, just as quickly, the man regained his footing, pulling a knife from his jacket and lunging toward Forge. Maya screamed. The knife flashed in the dim light, and Forge barely had time to react as the man aimed for his side. But before the man could make contact, Forge sidestepped, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting it hard. The knife dropped to the ground with a sharp clang. Forge shoved the man back, sending him stumbling to the ground. For a moment, the world stood still. Then, in the silence, Forge turned to Maya, his eyes softening as he knelt in front of her. "It's over. You're safe now," he said, his voice a whisper. But in his heart, Forge knew this was only the beginning. Forge stood tall, breathing heavily as he watched the man struggle on the ground, still trying to collect himself after the confrontation. Maya, standing behind him, was still trembling, but Forge could see that her fear was slowly giving way to relief. She was safe for now, but Forge knew better than anyone that danger wasn't always so easily vanquished. The man who had attacked them wasn't alone, and this wasn't just a random encounter. This was a message. Is he going to get up? Maya's voice was small, but Forge could hear the hint of worry still lingering in her words. He glanced down at the man, who was now groaning and trying to push himself up from the dirt. The knife lay on the ground beside him, discarded for the moment, but the threat was far from over. "He won't be bothering us anymore," Forge said, his voice firm, though his eyes never left the man. "But he's part of something bigger, something you don't need to worry about right now." Maya didn't respond right away, but Forge could feel her uncertainty. The world she had known, the safety she had taken for granted, was crumbling around her. All of this was happening because of one simple truth: she had been targeted. She was in danger, and Forge wasn't going to let that danger reach her again. He turned back to Maya and took a step closer to her. "Come on, let's get you inside," he said, his voice softer now. The cabin's door creaked as Forge pushed it open, the old wood groaning under the weight of the storm that was still swirling outside. Maya stepped in first, her small frame hesitant as she crossed the threshold. Forge followed behind her, closing the door with a soft thud. The cabin was dimly lit, the faint light from the single window casting long shadows across the floor. It smelled of damp wood and old memories, the kind of place that had seen years of solitude. But to Forge, it was the safest place he could offer right now. He locked the door behind them, securing it as best as he could, knowing that they couldn't afford to take chances. Maya stood in the middle of the room, her arms wrapped tightly around her chest. Her eyes were wide, scanning every corner of the cabin as if expecting something to jump out at her. Forge could see the wariness in her. It was the same look he had seen in the eyes of countless others, the look of someone who had lost their sense of safety. "You're okay," Forge said, moving to the small kitchen area where a single oil lamp flickered on the counter. "You're safe here, at least for tonight." Maya didn't answer immediately. She was still staring at the door, as if she expected it to burst open at any moment. Forge knew how she felt. He had been there once, too, waiting for the danger to arrive. "What now?" Maya's voice broke through his thoughts, a tremor still lingering in her words. Forge turned back to her, his eyes steady. "Now we wait." Maya's eyes flicked to him, confusion clouding her expression. "Wait for what?" "For them to come," Forge said quietly. "They won't stop until they get what they want. But we'll be ready." Maya swallowed hard, looking down at the floor for a moment as if trying to absorb the weight of his words. Forge could see her struggling to understand the magnitude of what was happening. This wasn't just some random act of violence. This was part of something much larger. The man who had attacked them was just a pawn in a dangerous game, and Forge wasn't sure how far this game would go. "Who are they?" Maya asked, her voice barely a whisper. Forge sighed, rubbing his hand over his face. "I don't know exactly, but I know enough to say they don't give up easily." He paused, thinking for a moment. "But it doesn't matter. We'll handle it, one step at a time. Right now, the only thing that matters is getting you to safety." Maya nodded slowly, her shoulders sagging as if some of the tension had eased from her. "I don't want to be scared anymore," she said softly. Forge's heart tightened at the words. He had heard that same plea from so many before her. And while he couldn't promise her that the world would stop being dangerous, he could promise her this: she wasn't alone. "You won't be," Forge said, stepping toward her and placing a hand on her shoulder. "Not as long as I'm here." He could feel her stiffen slightly, but she didn't pull away. Forge had always believed in loyalty, in keeping promises, and right now, he had made one to a dying man he couldn't forget. Tyrone had asked him to watch over Maya, to protect her, and Forge was going to keep that promise, no matter what it took. The cabin was quiet, the only sound the soft crackle of the fire in the corner. Outside, the storm was still raging, the wind howling as it slammed against the windows. Forge knew they couldn't stay here forever, but for tonight, it was enough. They were safe, for now. As Forge turned to check the locks once more, he heard a faint noise coming from outside. His hand froze on the handle. Someone was out there, moving in the shadows. Forge's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure if it was the same car that had chased them, or if it was something worse, but one thing was certain: the night wasn't over yet. Forge's hand gripped the door handle, his muscles tense as he listened. The soft crackling of the fire was the only sound breaking the oppressive silence in the cabin. The wind had died down outside, but the storm in Forge's mind was just beginning. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching, waiting. He had been trained to trust his instincts, and right now, they were screaming at him to act. Maya stood behind him, her small figure barely visible in the dim light. Her eyes were wide, filled with fear, but there was something else there now, something that told him she wasn't the helpless little girl she had been when they first met. She was stronger than that. Forge turned, his gaze locking with hers. "Stay here," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "Lock the door and don't come out no matter what." Maya nodded, her expression a mixture of fear and determination. She understood. She didn't need to be told twice. She had seen enough already to know that Forge wasn't someone who would let her down. With a final look at her, Forge stepped into the shadows, his body moving silently as he moved toward the window. He crouched low, peering out into the night. At first, he saw nothing, just the swaying of the trees, the moonlight filtering through the branches. But then, there it was, a shadow, barely visible, moving along the edge of the forest. Forge's heart raced as his eyes tracked the figure. It was too far away to make out clearly, but the silhouette was unmistakable. It was a person, someone who knew the woods as well as Forge did. Someone who was moving with purpose, and that purpose was clear. They were looking for him. He turned back to the cabin, making sure Maya was still inside. She had locked the door, just like he told her to. He knew she was scared, but he also knew she was tough. She would be all right as long as she stayed hidden. But Forge couldn't afford to wait any longer. Whoever was out there wasn't going to give up. Forge grabbed his jacket, pulling it on quickly. His mind raced as he considered his options. He could try to confront the person head-on, but that would put Maya in danger. No, that wasn't the plan. He needed to get the upper hand. He moved quickly, quietly, to the back door of the cabin. The wind had picked up again, and Forge used it to mask his footsteps as he made his way around the side of the cabin. The sound of branches scraping against the cabin walls made him flinch, but he pressed on. He had to know who was out there. As he crept closer to the edge of the forest, Forge's mind flashed back to the encounter earlier with the man in the black sedan. That wasn't just a random attack. Whoever was behind that was still out there, pulling the strings, and they weren't going to stop until they had what they wanted. The thought of Maya's father, of the promise he had made, gave Forge the strength to push forward. He couldn't let this end like that. Not again. The figure in the forest grew clearer, closer now. Forge held his breath as he crouched behind a tree, his eyes narrowing as the person stepped into the clearing. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap that obscured most of his features. Forge's fingers tightened around the grip of the knife he had retrieved from the ground earlier. The man's movement was cautious, almost too cautious, like he was trying not to make any noise. Forge's instincts told him the man wasn't just another goon. This was someone who knew what they were doing. The man stopped in the clearing, his head swiveling as if he was scanning the area. Forge held his breath, waiting for the right moment. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. The man took another step forward, his boot crunching against the dry leaves. That was all Forge needed. He sprang from behind the tree, moving fast, silent. The man never saw it coming. Forge tackled him from behind, knocking him to the ground with a force that left the man gasping for air. They struggled briefly, but Forge quickly overpowered him, pinning the man's arms to the ground. "Who are you?" Forge growled, his voice low and deadly. The man grunted, trying to free himself. "Doesn't matter," he spat. "You can't stop this." Forge's heart pounded in his chest. He pressed harder, his knee digging into the man's chest. "Who sent you?" The man's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a sneer. "You're too late. They're already here." With one last surge of strength, the man bucked beneath Forge, throwing him off. Forge rolled to the side, quickly regaining his footing. The man scrambled to his feet, but Forge was already on him, his fist connecting with the man's jaw with a sickening crack. The man staggered back, dazed, but Forge wasn't finished. He stepped forward, his fists clenched, ready to end it. But then, a sound stopped him dead in his tracks. A car engine, distant but unmistakable, roared to life. The man's eyes widened as he looked past Forge, his expression suddenly filled with fear. "It's not just me," he said, his voice trembling. "They're coming for you, Forge." Forge didn't need to hear more. He knew who was behind this now. They had found him. The game had changed. Maya was no longer safe, and Forge was running out of time. Forge's heart pounded in his chest as the car engine grew louder, its roar signaling the approach of whoever was after them. The man he had just subdued, still groaning on the ground, had given him the chilling confirmation that this was no random attack. The people after him weren't just looking for a confrontation. They had a plan, and Maya was at the center of it. Forge's gaze flicked to the cabin, where Maya was still inside. He needed to get to her, but his options were running out. Forge's eyes narrowed as he turned back to the man on the ground. "Who else is coming?" Forge demanded, his voice low and threatening. The man chuckled weakly, spitting blood onto the dirt. "It's too late for you, Forge. They're already here." That was all Forge needed to hear. He didn't have time for more answers, not when Maya was in danger. He turned and sprinted back toward the cabin, the weight of his boots thudding against the dirt path. The wind had picked up again, howling through the trees as if nature itself was warning him. Forge could feel the eyes of whoever was out there, watching, waiting for him to slip up. But he couldn't afford to think about that now. Maya was waiting. He reached the door in seconds, throwing it open and slamming it shut behind him. The cabin was silent, the only sound the wind rattling the old windows. Maya was standing near the small table, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. "Forge," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What's happening? Who was that man?" Forge took a deep breath, trying to calm himself before he answered. "We're not safe yet," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos inside his mind. "We need to move, now." Maya's eyes filled with fear, but she didn't argue. She knew something was wrong, and she trusted Forge enough to follow his lead. She grabbed her jacket from the corner and rushed to the door, but Forge stopped her. "No," he said firmly, his hand on her arm. "I need you to stay hidden. Do you understand?" Maya nodded, but Forge could see the hesitation in her eyes. She didn't want to be left behind. She didn't want to feel weak. "I'll be back," Forge added quickly, his voice softer now. "Just stay here, and don't open the door for anyone." He saw the fear in her eyes, but she trusted him. She had to. Maya nodded again, and Forge could see the tears brimming in her eyes. He hated seeing her like this, but there was no time to comfort her. He turned, moving quickly toward the back of the cabin where he had stored his gear. His mind raced as he grabbed his gun and checked the magazine. It was loaded, ready to go. He couldn't afford to hesitate. He couldn't afford to lose Maya. The door to the cabin creaked as someone knocked softly, almost cautiously. Forge froze, his body instinctively tensing. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by the sound of footsteps retreating into the darkness. Forge's heart rate picked up. Whoever it was, they were trying to make it seem like they were just passing through. But Forge wasn't fooled. He knew better. He checked the window, scanning the area outside. His breath caught in his throat as he saw a figure moving in the distance, just outside the glow of the cabin's single light. It was too far away to make out clearly, but Forge could see enough to know it wasn't someone he recognized. It wasn't someone he trusted. Forge's fingers tightened around the gun as he stepped back from the window. He had to make a choice. He couldn't stay hidden in the cabin, not with Maya inside. He had to find out who was out there, and he had to do it fast. But as Forge moved toward the door, a sudden thought hit him. What if the person outside wasn't just looking for him? What if they were here for Maya? Forge took a deep breath, pushing the thought aside. He couldn't waste time worrying. He had to act. Forge opened the door slowly, just enough to peek out, his senses on high alert. The wind howled again, drowning out most of the sounds from outside, but he could still hear the faint crackling of leaves underfoot. The figure was moving closer now, just on the edge of the light. Forge couldn't wait any longer. He stepped outside, the door clicking shut behind him. The moment his boots hit the ground, the figure froze. Forge could feel his muscles tense as he reached for the gun, but before he could draw it, the figure stepped forward into the light. It was a woman, her face partially obscured by the hood of her jacket. She looked young, maybe a little older than Maya, but her eyes held something cold, something calculating. "Looking for me?" Forge asked, his voice a mixture of anger and confusion. The woman didn't respond right away. Instead, she studied him for a moment, as if weighing her options. Then, with a sudden motion, she pulled out a knife, holding it low in her hand. "You've got something that belongs to them," she said quietly. Forge's mind raced as he took a step back, keeping his eyes on her, but she was already advancing. He didn't need to wait for her to get closer. He moved first, circling around her, ready for whatever came next. Maya was still in the cabin, and he wasn't going to let anything happen to her. The woman lunged, the knife flashing in the dim light. Forge sidestepped, grabbing her wrist and twisting it, forcing the knife from her hand. But she wasn't done yet. With a swift kick, she knocked Forge off balance, sending him stumbling back. He regained his footing just in time to see her grab another knife from her belt. She was fast, and she wasn't afraid. Forge had to think quickly. The woman rushed him again, but this time, Forge was ready. He stepped forward, grabbing her by the shoulders and throwing her to the ground. She hit the dirt hard, her breath escaping in a gasp. "Who are you working for?" Forge demanded, his voice low and dangerous. The woman looked up at him, her eyes filled with something like pity. "You really don't know, do you?" she whispered, before slipping into unconsciousness. Forge stood over the woman, breathing heavily as the adrenaline slowly left his system. His hand was still gripping the knife she had attempted to use against him. His mind raced, processing everything that had happened so far. She had come for something, and that something was most likely Maya. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Whatever was happening, it was all connected, and it was bigger than him. Bigger than just one fight, one man, or even one woman. They were part of something much more dangerous. Forge took a step back from the woman lying unconscious on the ground. He needed answers, but she wasn't going to provide them in her current state. His eyes flicked toward the cabin, and for a brief moment, he wondered if Maya was still safe. He couldn't leave her alone any longer. He had to move quickly, but carefully. Every instinct told him not to trust anyone who showed up uninvited, especially in the middle of a storm, and with someone like her out there, Forge knew it wasn't over yet. He grabbed the woman's arms and dragged her to the side of the cabin, out of sight. Forge then made his way back to the door, his hand on the knob, ready to make sure that Maya was still inside, still safe. As the door creaked open, he saw her standing by the window, her eyes wide with fear, her expression questioning what was happening outside. "Forge," Maya whispered. "What was that?" "Who is she?" "She's one of them," Forge replied, his voice tight with tension. "But we don't have time to deal with her right now." Maya's brow furrowed, confusion clouding her face. "Who are they? Why do they want me?" Forge exhaled sharply and walked over to her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I'm going to keep you safe, but you need to trust me. We can't stay here. They'll be back, and we need to move." "But where do we go?" Maya's voice cracked, the fear clear in her eyes. Forge hesitated for a moment. He couldn't tell her everything. She was still just a kid, and he needed her to stay focused. "There's a place," Forge said, his voice low, reassuring. "A place where we can figure out what's going on. But right now, we need to leave. Do you understand?" Maya nodded slowly, her fears slowly giving way to trust. Forge grabbed her jacket, his hand firm as he placed it on her shoulders. "Stay close to me. Don't make a sound." They moved swiftly, silently, out the back door, Forge's mind constantly scanning for any signs of movement. As they crossed the yard, Forge glanced back toward the cabin, his thoughts racing. The woman he had just fought wasn't just a random attacker. There was a purpose behind everything. Whoever was after Maya was determined to find her, and that meant they would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. Forge's eyes narrowed. He would stop them, but to do that, he needed to figure out who was behind this and why. His mind turned to the figure in the sedan, the man who had chased them earlier. He had been too calm, too certain. Forge was sure that man wasn't working alone. There was a network, a group of people, pulling strings from the shadows. And that network had Maya in its sights. As they moved through the woods, Forge's senses heightened. The sound of leaves crunching underfoot was the only noise they made, but every step felt like it was taking them further into danger. The storm had finally passed, but the stillness of the night felt ominous, as if the world itself was holding its breath. They reached the edge of the woods, and Forge paused, scanning the area for any signs of movement. The road ahead was quiet, but he knew better than to trust the silence. He could feel the weight of the night pressing in on him. It wasn't just the shadows of the trees that unsettled him. It was the knowledge that they were being hunted, and that hunt was about to get much worse. Forge turned to Maya, lowering his voice to a whisper. "We need to keep moving, but we can't stay on the road. We'll take the back way through the hills. It's longer, but it'll keep us hidden." Maya nodded, her face pale but determined. Forge squeezed her shoulder gently before they moved off the road and into the overgrown path that led into the hills. As they walked, Forge couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and he kept his hand close to the gun holstered at his side. The last thing he needed was another surprise. He had promised Maya's father that he would protect her. He had promised to keep her safe. But promises were harder to keep when the world around you was crumbling. The path was narrow, overgrown with brush and trees that clawed at their clothes as they passed. The moonlight barely filtered through the canopy of leaves above, casting everything in shadow. Forge's senses were on high alert, his mind constantly calculating their next move. There was no room for mistakes. Not now. As they neared the top of the hill, Forge stopped, holding up a hand to signal Maya to stay still. He scanned the area below them, his eyes sharp. Down in the valley, the lights of a car flashed through the trees. Someone was out there, looking for them. Forge's breath caught in his throat. He knew they had been spotted. This was it. The next move would decide everything. They couldn't outrun this. They couldn't hide forever. Forge's hand tightened around the grip of his gun, ready for whatever came next. Forge's breath was steady, but his heart hammered in his chest as he crouched low behind a boulder, scanning the path below. The car had stopped just outside the valley, the headlights cutting through the trees. The figures within the car were moving, but at a distance, it was hard to make out their intentions. Forge's hand never strayed far from his gun. Maya stood behind him, barely making a sound, her eyes wide with fear, but also an understanding of the gravity of their situation. They had to stay quiet, stay hidden. The world felt like it was closing in on them, the shadows stretching longer as the night deepened. Forge's mind raced, running through the possible scenarios. He had expected this. He knew it was only a matter of time before someone tracked them down. But now, standing here, with Maya beside him, it felt different. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about keeping her safe, no matter what. He had made a promise to her father, and he wasn't about to break it. The car sat still in the valley, the figures now emerging from it. Two men, both wearing dark clothes and carrying something that looked like bags, moved toward the wooded area ahead. Forge clenched his jaw, realizing they were looking for something, or someone. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. It was only a matter of time before they would come searching the hills, and Forge wasn't sure they had enough time to make it to safety. His mind flicked back to the cabin. The woman, the one he had fought earlier, was still unconscious, and that left more unanswered questions. Who were they working for? Why was Maya so important? And what was the network behind this all? His thoughts were interrupted by a faint noise, a branch snapping behind him. Forge spun around instantly, his heart leaping in his throat. Maya gasped softly, but didn't make a sound otherwise. Forge looked at her, motioning for her to stay still. It wasn't just the men from the car. Someone else was out there, closer than ever. Forge's instincts were screaming at him to move fast, but he had to be careful. The last thing he needed was for Maya to be caught in the open. He motioned for her to follow him, keeping low as they moved behind the cover of trees, heading further into the hills. The wind shifted, making the leaves rustle loudly, but Forge didn't care. He had to get them out of sight, out of the immediate danger zone. His mind worked quickly, scanning the area for an escape route, something that would take them out of this mess. As they continued to move through the dense brush, Forge's eyes caught a glimpse of something in the distance, an abandoned cabin, hidden in the shadows of the trees. It wasn't much, but it was shelter, and right now, that's all they needed. Forge motioned to Maya, who nodded silently. They moved toward the cabin, Forge staying ahead of her, his senses heightened. Every step felt like a gamble. They finally reached the door, and Forge pushed it open slowly, the hinges creaking in the silence. It was dark inside, but Forge could make out enough to see the outlines of old furniture and debris. He stepped inside, motioning for Maya to follow, then quickly closing the door behind them. They were safe, for now. Forge turned to Maya, his voice low but firm. "Stay here. I'll keep watch." Maya nodded, her eyes wide with uncertainty. "What if they come here?" she whispered, her voice shaky. Forge paused for a moment, looking out the window toward the distant hills. "They might," he said, his voice steady. "But we'll be ready. We can't stop moving." Maya nodded again, but Forge could see the fear in her eyes. She was just a kid, and none of this was her fault. But Forge couldn't let himself get distracted by that. He had to focus. Focus on getting them through the night. The sounds of the wind howling outside were the only thing that broke the silence in the cabin. Forge moved to the window, peeking through a small crack in the wood, trying to spot any movement. His instincts told him they were still being watched. The figures outside had likely moved, but Forge couldn't shake the feeling that they were closing in. He couldn't let his guard down. He needed to keep Maya safe, but to do that, he had to know who was behind this. Forge turned back to Maya, his face hardening with resolve. "We'll figure this out," he said, though he wasn't sure if it was for her or for himself. Maya didn't respond, but her gaze followed him, the weight of the situation sinking in. They weren't alone in this fight. But as Forge stood in the cabin, his mind still racing with thoughts of who was behind this and why they wanted Maya, the reality of the situation hit him. The enemy wasn't just out there in the woods. They were everywhere, and Forge had a feeling they were only just getting started. The cabin was eerily quiet, the only sound the soft whisper of the wind outside, rattling the windows as if warning them of something even darker approaching. Forge stood near the small, grimy window, peering through the crack, his mind racing with the events of the past few hours. They were still out there, those who wanted Maya, and Forge knew it was only a matter of time before they found the cabin. The realization sank in. He couldn't keep running. He had to confront this head-on. His promise to Maya's father weighed heavily on him. He had sworn to protect her, and so far, he had kept that promise, but the stakes were higher than ever. Forge turned away from the window and faced Maya, who had been sitting silently in the corner, her face pale but her eyes sharp. She was still scared, still uncertain, but Forge could see the resilience forming behind that fear. "Maya, I need you to listen carefully," Forge said, his voice low, the tension in it unmistakable. Maya looked up, her eyes meeting his. "You're not going to be alone in this. We're going to get through it, but we need to stay sharp. We need to make sure they don't find us." Maya nodded slowly, her gaze unwavering. "I trust you, Forge," she said softly. Forge's heart clenched at her words, but there was no time to dwell on it. They were both in this now, and there was no turning back. Forge moved to the door, checking it for any signs of tampering. The locks were still intact, but Forge knew better than to rely solely on that. The people hunting them weren't amateurs. They knew how to track people down. He had to be ready for anything. He turned to Maya once more. "Stay here. If I'm not back in 15 minutes, lock the door and find a way to get out of here. Don't wait for me. You understand?" Maya's eyes widened, her fear returning, but she nodded. "I understand." Forge could see she didn't want him to go, but she also knew he had no choice. He couldn't protect her from here. He had to find out who was behind this, and to do that, he had to take the fight to them. He stepped outside, the cool air biting at his skin as he slipped into the shadows of the trees. The forest was dense, and the moonlight barely filtered through the canopy, leaving him to move mostly by feel. Forge's footsteps were silent as he moved deeper into the woods, every sense on high alert. He could feel the presence of someone nearby, watching, waiting. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and he could feel his pulse quicken. They were close. Forge stopped and crouched low, scanning the area. He spotted movement ahead, a figure moving through the trees. Not one of his allies. Not someone he recognized. Forge's hand moved to the gun at his side, his fingers tightening around the grip. He had to act fast. The figure was closing in, and Forge couldn't afford to wait any longer. He sprang forward, moving swiftly and silently, using the trees for cover as he closed the distance between him and the stranger. He was close enough now to make out details. Dark clothes, a hooded jacket, and the unmistakable stance of someone who knew how to move in the shadows. The figure turned suddenly, seemingly sensing Forge's presence. Forge froze, his breath catching in his throat as the figure's eyes locked onto his. "You're not supposed to be here," the man said in a low, cold voice. His hands moved to his sides, ready for a fight. Forge's grip on his gun tightened, but he kept it holstered for now. He needed information, not another confrontation. "Who are you working for?" Forge demanded, his voice low and steady. The man's lips curled into a smirk, but he didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "You really think you can stop this? You think you can save her?" His words hit Forge like a punch to the gut. "What do you want with her?" Forge's voice was harsher now, frustration and anger building. "She's just a kid." The man's expression hardened. "She's not just a kid. She's part of something much bigger than you. You're in over your head, Forge. It's too late." Forge's mind raced, trying to process the man's words. Who were these people, and why was Maya so important? The man took another step forward, and Forge, feeling the tension rise, stepped back, ready for whatever came next. But before the man could make a move, a faint sound behind him caught his attention. He turned just in time to see another figure emerging from the darkness, this one much larger, moving toward him at a steady pace. The second figure didn't speak. Forge didn't wait for him to get any closer. He lunged forward, knocking the first man off balance, forcing him to the ground with a grunt. He spun to face the second figure, but it was already too late. The larger man grabbed him by the shoulders and threw him against a nearby tree with brutal force. Forge's breath left his chest as he slammed into the rough bark, pain shooting through his back. He barely had time to recover before the larger man was on him, lifting him off the ground with one hand. "You should have stayed out of this," the man growled, his grip tightening. Forge's mind raced, every muscle screaming for him to fight back. He reached for his gun, but the larger man's hold was too strong. Forge twisted, using every ounce of strength to break free. With a sudden surge, he managed to pull away, but not before the man landed a punch to his stomach, knocking the wind out of him. Forge stumbled back, gasping for air, but he wasn't finished yet. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Forge's head was still reeling from the punch, his vision blurry as he struggled to regain his footing. The larger man loomed over him, a shadow of menace. His breath came in ragged bursts, and his body ached with every movement. But Forge had faced worse before. He had to survive this. He had to get back to Maya. The larger man cracked his knuckles, the sound echoing in the tense silence. "You're not walking away from this," the man growled, his voice low and threatening. Forge wiped the blood from his lip, his eyes narrowing. "I'm not here to fight you," he said, his voice hoarse but filled with determination. "I'm here to protect her." The man's laugh was cold and devoid of humor. "You think you can protect her?" he spat. "You're already too late." Forge's fists clenched as his mind raced. He had to outsmart this man. The only chance he had was to move faster than his opponent, strike first. The larger man lunged at him, but Forge was ready. He sidestepped, the man's massive body crashing into the tree behind him. Forge didn't hesitate. He slammed his elbow into the man's back, forcing him to stumble forward. The man grunted, but Forge didn't give him time to recover. He followed with a quick jab to the side, forcing the man back further, away from him. The larger man growled in frustration and spun around, grabbing Forge by the collar and lifting him off the ground. The grip was like iron, and Forge could feel his air being cut off as the man squeezed tighter. His vision started to blur again, but he couldn't afford to lose focus. With every ounce of strength he had left, Forge brought his knee up hard into the man's ribs, causing him to grunt in pain. For a moment, the man faltered, just enough for Forge to break free. He dropped to the ground, gasping for air, and took a step back, eyes locked on his opponent. "You're going to regret this," the man snarled, blood dripping from his lip. "You don't know who you're messing with." Forge didn't have time for threats. He reached for the gun holstered at his side, his fingers trembling as he drew it out. The man's eyes widened slightly, but Forge didn't give him the chance to act. He aimed the gun at the man's chest, the barrel steady in his grip. "I don't care who you are," Forge said, his voice low and dangerous. "Stay out of my way." The man's expression shifted, something like hesitation flickering in his eyes. But before he could make a move, a sound broke the tension. A car engine, distant but unmistakable, rumbled from somewhere deeper in the woods. Forge's attention snapped to the sound, his grip tightening on the gun. The man seemed to sense the same thing, his eyes flicking to the sound of the engine. "It's them," the man muttered, his voice tinged with a mix of frustration and fear. Forge didn't wait to hear more. He holstered his gun and turned toward the woods. There was no time to deal with this now. Maya was still out there, and he had to get back to her. "Stay here," Forge said, glancing back at the man who was still recovering from the blow to his chest. "And if I see you again, I won't hesitate." The larger man said nothing, just stood there, watching Forge as he sprinted back into the woods. Forge's heart pounded in his chest as he moved quickly, weaving through the trees. His mind was focused on one thing, getting back to Maya. The car engine grew louder as he neared the clearing where he had left her. His instincts were screaming at him that this was it, that the people after them were closing in. Forge pushed himself harder, his legs burning as he ran. As he reached the edge of the clearing, He slowed, his eyes scanning for any sign of movement. The cabin was still there, but it looked eerily silent. Forge's gut twisted. Something wasn't right. He crept toward the door, moving slowly, keeping his body low to the ground. As he reached for the handle, a noise made him freeze. The door creaked open slightly, and Forge's eyes darted around the area. There was no one in sight, but he could feel the weight of the air, the tension, the danger. He pushed the door open slowly, just enough to slip inside. The cabin was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon outside. He moved cautiously, his senses heightened as he made his way through the small space. "Maya," he whispered, his voice low. No answer. He moved deeper into the cabin, his gun still in hand. The silence was thick, almost suffocating. Then he heard it, the faint sound of footsteps coming from the back. Forge's heart skipped a beat. He turned, moving toward the sound. But before he could make another move, a figure stepped out of the shadows. Maya. She was standing there, her eyes wide with fear, but with a hint of relief when she saw him. "Forge," she whispered. "I heard something. I think they're here." Forge's heart sank. They had found them. It was only a matter of time before the others arrived. He stepped forward, reaching out to her. "We need to go," he said quickly, pulling her toward the back door. "We don't have much time." Maya nodded, her eyes still filled with fear, but now with determination. Forge knew they had to leave the cabin, but where could they go? How much longer could they run? The answer didn't matter. They were in this together now, and as long as they kept moving, as long as they fought back, they still had a chance. Forge's pulse raced as he pulled Maya through the back door of the cabin, his mind spinning with the danger they were in. They had no time to waste. The sounds of footsteps outside, muffled voices, the unmistakable growl of engines starting. Forge could hear them all. They were closing in. The calm that had settled over the cabin moments ago shattered as reality slammed back into place. He had hoped to make it through the night unnoticed, but it was clear that their pursuers were no longer going to let them slip away. Forge pulled Maya closer, his hand gripping hers tightly as they moved into the thick woods behind the cabin. The forest was dense, the trees thick with the shadows of the night. Each step felt like a risk, each rustling branch, each snap of a twig felt louder than the last. But Forge kept moving, the instinct to protect Maya driving him forward. "Keep quiet," Forge whispered urgently, his breath heavy as they pushed deeper into the woods. Maya nodded, her eyes wide with fear, but she didn't say a word. They had been running for what felt like an eternity, the weight of the situation settling heavier with each passing second. They needed to put distance between themselves and the men looking for them. They couldn't afford to stay in one place for too long. The night seemed to stretch on endlessly. The soft glow of the moon above barely filtered through the thick canopy of trees, casting eerie shadows on the forest floor. It felt like they were surrounded by darkness, but Forge refused to stop. Every instinct screamed at him to keep going, to never stop until they were safe. Forge's mind raced through their options. He couldn't afford to underestimate their pursuers. They had to be prepared for anything. They couldn't trust anyone, couldn't assume anyone was on their side. Not anymore. The memory of the woman he had fought earlier flashed through his mind. She had been working for someone, but who? Forge didn't have the answers yet, but he would get them. He had no choice. As they pushed forward, Forge's mind turned to the place he had been thinking about earlier, the place he had hoped to reach in time. It wasn't far now. The old cabin he had used as a hideout years ago. It had been a safe house for him in the past, a place no one knew about. But now, it was their only chance. They had to make it there. As they continued through the woods, the sounds of the engines grew louder. They weren't alone. Forge could feel the presence of the men closing in. They were coming. Forge pushed himself harder, his breath growing more labored, but he didn't stop. Maya was still behind him, her footsteps barely audible as she tried to keep up. He could feel her fear, but he knew she was strong. She had proven that to him. Over and over. They had made it this far together, and they would keep going. They had no other choice. "Almost there," Forge muttered, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to Maya or to himself. The old cabin was just ahead. They were close. Forge pushed forward, his feet pounding against the forest floor. The cabin's shape began to emerge through the trees, and Forge felt a surge of relief. They had made it. But just as he thought they were safe, a sound froze him in place. A twig snapped. Forge's head whipped around, his eyes scanning the shadows. He couldn't see anyone, but the sound had been too distinct to ignore. Someone was out there. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. His grip on Maya's hand tightened, and he gently pulled her behind him. "Stay quiet," he whispered. Maya nodded, her eyes wide, her hand shaking slightly in his. They had to be close. Forge's mind raced. He had no idea how many men were out there. He had no idea if the others had already surrounded the cabin. He couldn't let his guard down, not for a second. He crouched low, keeping his body pressed to the ground. His eyes flicked back to the cabin. They were almost there, but there was something about the silence now that made it feel wrong. Every muscle in his body screamed to move, but he couldn't risk it. Not until he was sure. Another noise. Forge's heart skipped a beat as a figure emerged from the shadows. A man. He was moving slowly, carefully, as if searching. Forge's hand went to the knife at his side, but before he could make a move, the man stopped. He was close enough now for Forge to make out the outline of his features. Dark hair, a hood pulled low over his face. But there was something familiar about him. Forge's mind raced, trying to place him, but before he could make the connection, the man raised his hand, signaling for someone to come closer. Forge's breath caught in his throat. He wasn't alone. The man was not alone. Forge could hear the others now, moving silently through the trees. The figure in front of him had led them straight into an ambush. Forge's pulse quickened as he realized they were surrounded. He wasn't going to make it to the cabin. They weren't going to make it out of here. But Forge wasn't going to give up. Not without a fight. He gritted his teeth, his heart pounding. There was no way out now, no more running. But he wasn't going down without a fight. Not while Maya was still with him. Not while he still had breath in his body. Forge's mind raced as the realization hit him. They were surrounded. He could hear the movement of at least 3 men closing in, their footsteps light but deliberate, as if they knew exactly where they were. His heart beat faster, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Maya was still with him, just behind his shoulder, her breathing shallow, her fear palpable. He couldn't let them take her. He couldn't let them win. Forge kept his body low to the ground, barely breathing, his senses on full alert. He counted the men in his head, at least 3 for sure, maybe more hidden in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But Forge wasn't going to wait. He wasn't going to be the one to get cornered. His hands went to the small knife at his side, his fingers wrapping around the handle, ready for whatever came next. His breath was steady, controlled, but his mind was calculating, moving through every possible outcome, weighing every decision. He had to act fast. The figure closest to him moved closer, stepping lightly through the forest underbrush. Forge's muscles coiled, his body ready to spring into action. He waited for the perfect moment to strike. And then, without warning, the man came into full view. Forge's instincts kicked in immediately. He lunged forward, closing the distance between them with a sudden, powerful burst of speed. The man's eyes widened in surprise as Forge tackled him to the ground, the two of them crashing into the dirt. The man struggled, but Forge was faster. He pinned the man's arms to the ground, his knee pressing into his chest, his face inches from the man's. "Who the hell are you working for?" Forge growled through clenched teeth, his grip tightening around the man's neck. The man gasped for air, his eyes wide with panic, but he didn't speak. Forge tightened his grip. "Tell me now," Forge demanded. The man's lips parted, but before he could say anything, a voice echoed from the darkness. "Let him go, or it'll be worse for both of you." Forge froze, his eyes flicking toward the source of the voice. Another figure stepped out of the shadows, tall and imposing, holding a rifle at the ready. This man was different, calmer, more methodical, like someone who had been in charge of situations like this before. "Drop him," the man said again, his voice cold. Forge weighed his options. He couldn't take on both of them, not in the open. But he wasn't about to give in. Slowly, he stood up, releasing the man beneath him. The figure with the rifle moved forward, his eyes never leaving Forge, calculating, assessing. "You don't want to make this harder than it has to be," the man said, his eyes narrowing. Forge remained silent, his gaze steady. His grip on the knife in his hand tightened. If they wanted a fight, they were going to get one. The man with the rifle stepped closer, but Forge didn't flinch. "What do you want with her?" Forge asked, his voice low but firm. The man smirked. "She's part of something bigger than you can imagine. And you're in the way." You've been in the way from the start. The words hit Forge like a punch. What the hell are you talking about? He asked, his voice rising with anger. The man shrugged. You wouldn't understand. But you're going to find out soon enough. His eyes flicked to the other man, who was slowly getting to his feet, wiping dirt from his jacket. Take him down, the man with the rifle said. Make sure he doesn't cause any more problems. The second man, now fully recovered, advanced, pulling a gun from his belt. Forge's heart rate spiked, his mind screaming for him to act. He needed to move, and he needed to move fast. Before the man with the rifle could react, Forge surged forward, using his speed and strength to knock the rifle aside. The shot rang out, but it missed by a mile. The second man aimed his gun, but Forge was already on him. With one swift motion, Forge slammed the heel of his boot into the man's wrist, knocking the gun free. The man staggered back in pain, giving Forge just enough time to close the gap. Forge tackled him to the ground, his fist connecting with the man's face with a sickening crunch. The man groaned in pain, but didn't fight back. Forge had him pinned, his knuckles white from the force of the punch. But then, a new sound reached Forge's ears, a car engine revving in the distance, growing louder. His heart sank. The reinforcements were coming. The man with the rifle was already moving, circling around Forge, his hand reaching for something in his jacket. Forge didn't wait. He pushed the man he had pinned to the ground and rushed toward the trees, pulling Maya with him. They had no time to waste. They had to get out of there, and fast. The forest was their only chance now. The sound of the engine grew closer, the men chasing them faster than Forge had hoped. But they weren't going to give up without a fight. Forge's mind was working quickly, assessing the terrain ahead, trying to find an escape route. He glanced over his shoulder to make sure Maya was still with him. Her eyes were wide with fear, but she was keeping up. They were in this together now. Forge didn't stop to look back again. He just kept running. The sound of the car was close now, too close. They had to make it out of this alive. There was no other option. Forge's legs burned as he pushed himself harder, the sound of the car engine growing louder behind them. The trees blurred past him, the rough terrain biting at his feet, but there was no time to slow down. Every breath he took felt like it could be his last if they didn't make it far enough. Maya was still with him, her hand gripped tightly in his, matching his pace as best as she could. He could feel the weight of her fear, but he couldn't afford to show his own. He had made a promise to her father, and he was going to keep it, no matter the cost. The car was gaining on them. Forge could hear the engine revving, and the headlights were just visible through the trees, cutting through the darkness. He glanced over his shoulder, making sure Maya was still behind him, still running, still keeping up. She was, but just barely. Forge knew they couldn't keep this pace for much longer. They had to find cover. The sound of tires crunching against gravel told Forge they were getting close. He glanced ahead, searching for any sign of an escape, any place to hide, but all he could see was the forest stretching on in every direction. Then, ahead, he saw it, a clearing. A small, abandoned shack stood at the edge, barely visible in the moonlight. It wasn't much, but it was their only chance. Forge gripped Maya's hand tighter and nodded toward the shack. We're almost there, he said, his voice low but urgent. Maya nodded, her face pale, but determination flashing in her eyes. They reached the clearing just as the car pulled into view, the headlights blinding in the darkness. Forge didn't hesitate. He pulled Maya into the shack, his hand on the door, pushing it open with one swift motion. The inside was dim, the air musty, but it was a safe place to hide, for now. Forge slammed the door behind them, locking it quickly. They were inside, but they weren't safe yet. Stay here, Forge whispered to Maya, his voice harsh with urgency. He moved to the window, peering through a crack in the wood. The car was still outside, its engine idling, and Forge could see two figures moving toward the shack. His heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't going to let them take Maya. Not now, not after everything they'd been through. He turned back to Maya, who was standing by the wall, her eyes wide with fear, but full of resolve. We can't stay here for long, Forge said, his voice low. They'll come looking for us. Maya nodded, though Forge could see the hesitation in her eyes. What do we do now? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Forge's mind raced. They were trapped, but not without options. He had a plan, he just needed a little more time. We wait, Forge said. We wait until they think we're gone, and then we make our move. He moved to the back of the shack, his eyes scanning for anything they could use. The place was old, abandoned, but Forge's trained eyes spotted something useful. A small crate of tools sat in the corner, and Forge immediately began sifting through it. He didn't have time to find everything he needed, but he grabbed what he could: a crowbar, a wrench, anything that could be used to buy them some time if things got worse. He turned back to Maya, his eyes meeting hers. "We'll be okay," he said, though he wasn't entirely sure he believed it himself. Maya didn't respond right away. She just stood there, looking at him, her eyes full of trust. Forge didn't have time to dwell on it. He had a job to do, and he couldn't fail her now. The sound of footsteps outside grew louder. Forge pressed his back against the wall, listening intently. The men were getting closer. The shack wasn't much of a fortress, but it would have to do. "Stay quiet," Forge whispered, his voice barely audible. Maya nodded, her eyes wide, and Forge could see her holding her breath, waiting. He did the same, listening for any sign of movement outside. His heart pounded in his chest, the silence deafening. The men were close. Forge's hand went to the crowbar he had grabbed earlier, his fingers tightening around it. He was ready. If they broke down the door, he would fight. He had no choice. But the footsteps stopped just outside, and Forge's heart skipped a beat. For a long moment, everything was still. The only sound was the wind rustling through the trees. Then, the door rattled. A voice from the outside broke the silence. "We know you're in there," the man said, his voice low and controlled. Forge's grip on the crowbar tightened. He wasn't going to give up without a fight. The man outside spoke again, his voice more insistent. "You're not going anywhere. Come out now, and we won't hurt you." Forge's jaw clenched. He knew that was a lie. They wanted Maya. They had been after her since the beginning, and now they were closing in. He had no choice. He had to take action. With one swift motion, Forge swung the crowbar at the door, smashing the lock. The door flew open, and before the men outside could react, Forge charged, the crowbar raised high. The first man barely had time to raise his arms before Forge's blow landed. The man stumbled back, clutching his head, and Forge swung again, knocking him to the ground. The second man came at him, but Forge was faster, his knee slamming into the man's chest, sending him crashing into the wall. It wasn't over yet, but Forge wasn't about to stop. Maya was still with him, and that meant he had to fight until the very end. With every move, every punch, he fought harder. He fought for her, and no one was going to take her from him. In this thrilling tale of survival and danger, the Hell Angel's stories unfold as a young girl finds herself caught in a web of intrigue and violence, with a former ally of her father, Forge, fighting to protect her at all costs. As the night grows darker and their enemies close in, Forge's unwavering determination to keep his promise to her father leads him through a series of high-stakes confrontations, all while the shadow of a powerful organization looms. The Hell Angel's stories reveal the lengths to which Forge will go to protect the young girl, Maya, as they face dangerous adversaries and uncover hidden truths. With every passing moment, the stakes grow higher, and Forge's ability to outwit and outfight those chasing them is tested to the limit. As their journey unfolds, the Hell Angel's stories provide a gripping narrative of loyalty, courage, and survival. The characters are drawn into a deeper mystery that pulls them into the heart of a dark world they are barely prepared for, and Forge must use all his strength and resourcefulness to keep them alive. These Hell Angel stories captivate with their raw action, emotional intensity, and unpredictable twists, making every chapter a roller coaster ride of excitement. Will they make it out alive, or will the forces hunting them prove too powerful to escape? As the danger intensifies, the Hell Angel stories deliver an unforgettable journey that tests the bonds between its characters, their will to survive, and their quest for truth.